The war that began as a direct confrontation between Iran, the United States, and Israel is no longer confined to a single battlefield. What started as a high-intensity conflict in the Persian Gulf has now expanded into something far more dangerous, a multi-front regional war. And now, a new player has officially entered the battlefield. From the mountains of Yemen to the skies over Israel, the Houthis have opened a new front, and this changes everything. In the early hours of March 28th, as the war entered its second month, air raid sirens echoed across southern Israel. A missile, launched from more than 2,000 kilometers away in Yemen, was heading toward Israeli territory. Within minutes, it was intercepted. No casualties were reported. But the message was loud and clear. This was not just another missile. This was a signal that the war is no longer limited to Iran. It is spreading. According to multiple reports, Yemen's Houthi forces launched not just one but multiple attacks, including ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones targeting Israeli military sites. And they didn't stop there. Within hours, they issued a warning that these attacks would continue until what they called aggression against allied forces ends. This marks the first time the Houthis have directly attacked Israel in this war, officially opening a new front in an already explosive conflict. But to understand why this matters, we need to understand who the Houthis are and why their entry could reshape the entire war. The Houthis are not just a local militia. They are one of the most powerful non-state military forces in the Middle East today. Originating from northern Yemen, the group emerged in the early 2000s as a political and religious movement. But over the years, they transformed into a battle-hardened force, one that now controls large parts of Yemen, including the capital, Sana'a. What makes them even more significant is their connection to Iran. For years, Iran has supported the Houthis, providing weapons, training, and strategic backing. This relationship has turned the Houthis into a key part of what analysts call the axis of resistance, a network of groups aligned against the United States and Israel. And now that network is activating. But here is where it gets even more dangerous. The Houthis are not just capable of launching missiles. They control one of the most strategically important regions in the world. Yemen sits along the Bab al-Mandab Strait, a narrow maritime choke point that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. Every year, billions of dollars worth of oil and goods pass through this route, and the Houthis have already shown they can disrupt it. In previous conflicts, they attacked commercial ships, damaged vessels, and forced global shipping routes to reroute, causing massive economic consequences. Now imagine this. At the same time, Iran is threatening the Strait of Hormuz. The Houthis could threaten the Bab al-Mandab, two of the world's most critical shipping choke points, both under pressure. This is not just a regional war anymore. This is a global risk, and the timing of their entry is not random. For weeks, the Houthis had been signaling that they were ready to join the war. Their spokesperson even warned that their fingers are on the trigger for direct intervention if the conflict escalates further. At first, many analysts believed this was just rhetoric, a warning, a pressure tactic. But now, that warning has become reality. At the same time, the broader war continues to intensify. Iran has been launching strikes across the region, targeting infrastructure in Gulf countries and military-linked facilities. Israel, meanwhile, has expanded its air campaign deep inside Iranian territory, striking military and strategic targets. And the United States is now considering even more aggressive options, including the possibility of ground operations. The scale of this conflict is growing by the day, and with every new player that enters, the chances of a wider war increase. But what makes the Houthis' involvement particularly significant is not just their capabilities, it is their strategy. Unlike traditional armies, the Houthis do not need to win large battles. They only need to disrupt, to create pressure, to stretch their enemies across multiple fronts. And that is exactly what they are doing. By launching attacks from Yemen, they force Israel and its allies to divide their attention, to defend not just their borders with Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, but now threats coming from the south as well. This is what military analysts call multi-front warfare. And it is one of the most difficult scenarios for any military to handle. But there is another layer to this story, one that makes it even more complex. The Houthis are not acting alone. Their actions are part of a broader regional alignment. Across the Middle East, multiple groups are now either directly or indirectly involved in this war. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is engaged. In Iraq, militias are active. And now in Yemen, the Houthis have joined in. This creates a network of pressure points surrounding Israel and U.S. interests from multiple directions. A coordinated, decentralized strategy, one that does not rely on a single battlefield, but many. And as this network expands, so does the risk of escalation, because every new front increases the chances of miscalculation. One missile that hits the wrong target, one attack that causes mass casualties, one response that goes too far. That is how regional wars turn into global crises, and we are already seeing the early signs. Global shipping routes are under threat. Insurance costs for vessels are rising, energy markets are reacting, countries are beginning to prepare for disruptions. This is no longer just about military strikes. This is about the global economy. But perhaps the most important question right now is this: why now? Why did the Houthis choose this moment to enter the war? The answer lies in timing and strategy. For weeks, they held back. They watched. They waited. And then, at a moment when the war reached a critical point, they stepped in. Not too early, not too late. Just enough to change the dynamics. And now, the war has entered a new phase. A phase where the battlefield is no longer defined by borders. Where attacks can come from thousands of kilometers away. Where non-state actors play as much of a role as powerful nations. Where the lines between local conflicts and global crises are disappearing. This is no longer just the Iran war, this is becoming a regional war. And possibly something even bigger. The opening of a new front by Yemen's Houthi forces is not just a military development. It is an economic shockwave in the making. Because this war is no longer being fought only with missiles and airstrikes. It is now being fought through trade routes, shipping lanes, and global supply chains. And at the center of this new battlefield lies one of the most critical waterways in the world, the Bab al-Mandab Strait. This narrow passage, located between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. It may look like just another stretch of water on the map, but in reality, it is one of the arteries of the global economy. Every single day, massive cargo ships pass through this route, carrying oil from the Middle East to Europe, goods from Asia to Western markets, and energy supplies that power entire nations. Now imagine what happens if this route becomes unsafe. We have already seen glimpses of that scenario. In past confrontations, the Houthis targeted commercial vessels, launched drones at tankers, and forced shipping companies to reconsider their routes. Some vessels were damaged, others were rerouted thousands of kilometers around Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and significantly increasing costs. That was during a limited conflict. Now we are looking at a full-scale regional war, and the Houthis have just stepped in. This means the risk is no longer theoretical, it is immediate. Shipping companies are already on edge. Insurance premiums for vessels traveling through the Red Sea are rising sharply. Some firms are quietly preparing contingency plans, rerouting ships even before direct attacks intensify. Because in modern warfare, perception is as powerful as reality. You do not need to shut down a trade route completely to disrupt it. You only need to make it dangerous enough. And that is exactly the strategy we are beginning to see. The Houthis do not need to block the Bab al-Mandab entirely. They only need to create uncertainty, enough to force global trade to slow down, to become more expensive, to become unpredictable. And when that happens, the effects ripple outward. Oil prices react first. Even a small disruption in supply routes can trigger spikes in global energy markets. Traders begin pricing in risk. Governments start preparing emergency reserves. Markets become volatile. Then comes the second wave. Supply chains. Goods that normally move quickly between continents begin to slow. Delays increase. Costs rise. Industries that rely on just-in-time deliveries begin to feel the pressure. From electronics to automobiles to food supplies, everything becomes more expensive. And then comes the third wave, inflation. What begins as a regional conflict starts showing up in everyday life across the world, in fuel prices, in shipping costs, in the price of basic goods. This is how a war in one region becomes a global economic problem, and this is why the Houthis' entry into the conflict matters far beyond the battlefield. But there is an even deeper layer to this strategy, because this is not happening in isolation. At the same time that the Bab al-Mandab is under threat, another choke point is also in focus, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway located between Iran and Oman handles a significant portion of the world's oil exports. For years, Iran has hinted that in a major conflict, it could disrupt or even block this route. Now consider the bigger picture. If pressure builds simultaneously on both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandab, two of the most critical energy corridors in the world could be affected at the same time, one controlled or influenced by Iran, the other threatened by its allied forces in Yemen. This creates a strategic pincer, a way to exert pressure not just on military opponents but on the global system itself. And that is where this conflict becomes truly dangerous. Because once global economic stability is at stake, more countries get involved, not necessarily with troops on the ground, but through political, economic, and even military support. European nations begin to worry about energy supplies. Asian economies start calculating trade disruptions. Major powers like China and Russia begin assessing how the shifting balance could impact their own interests. And slowly, the conflict begins to pull in actors who were not part of the original war. This is how regional wars expand, not always through direct invasion, but through interconnected consequences. But there is something else happening here, something less visible, but equally important. This war is revealing a new model of warfare, a model where states do not fight alone. Instead, they rely on networks, proxies, allied groups spread across different countries, each one capable of opening a new front, launching attacks, or creating pressure in a different way. Iran has spent years building such a network. In Lebanon, there is Hezbollah. In Iraq, various militias. In Syria, aligned forces. And now, in Yemen, the Houthis. Individually, each of these groups represents a challenge, but together they form something much more powerful, a distributed strategy, one that does not depend on a single battlefield or a single command center, one that is harder to predict, harder to contain, and harder to defeat. Because even if one front is controlled, another can open. Even if one group is weakened, others can continue the pressure. This is not traditional warfare. This is network warfare, and it is changing the rules of conflict. For Israel and the United States, this creates a complex dilemma. Do they respond to each front individually, risking overextension, or do they escalate directly against Iran, hoping to shut down the network at its source? Both options carry risks. Responding to each front spreads resources thin. Escalating directly against Iran risks triggering an even larger war. And this is exactly the strategic trap. A situation where every option carries consequences. A situation where there are no easy answers. And while military planners analyze these scenarios, the situation on the ground continues to evolve. Missile systems are being repositioned. Naval forces are increasing their presence in critical waterways. Air defense systems are being tested under real combat conditions. Each day brings new developments. Each day increases the complexity. But perhaps the most critical factor in all of this is time. Because the longer this war continues, the more opportunities there are for escalation, the more chances for mistakes, the more pressure builds on all sides. History has shown that prolonged conflicts rarely stay contained. They either de-escalate through diplomacy or they expand. And right now, the signs point toward expansion. The entry of the Houthis is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader shift, a transition from a contained conflict to a regional confrontation, and possibly beyond. Because once global trade routes are threatened, once energy supplies are at risk, once multiple regions are affected, the stakes change. This is no longer just about territory or military advantage. This is about influence, about control, about shaping the future balance of power. And in that kind of conflict, the rules are different, the objectives are bigger, the consequences are far-reaching, and the outcomes are uncertain. But there is still one question that remains unanswered. If this network continues to activate, if more groups join the fight, if more fronts open, what happens next? Does this remain a regional war, or does it cross a line into something far more dangerous? Because history has a pattern. Conflicts that involve multiple actors, multiple fronts, and global stakes rarely stay limited. They tend to escalate. They tend to draw in more players. They tend to reshape the world around them. And as this war enters its second month, with new fronts opening and new risks emerging, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. We are not just witnessing another conflict in the Middle East. We are watching a turning point, a moment where a regional war could evolve into a global crisis. And the decisions made in the coming days and weeks could determine just how far this escalation goes. As this war continues to expand, the most important question is no longer what has already happened. The real question is what happens next, because the path forward is no longer clear. What we are witnessing is not just a conflict unfolding in real time. It is a moment where multiple futures are possible, each one more dangerous than the last. To understand where this could go, we need to look at the scenarios now being quietly discussed by analysts, military planners, and governments around the world. The first scenario is the one everyone hopes for: controlled escalation. In this path, the conflict continues, but remains limited. Strikes continue between Iran, Israel, and allied forces, but all sides avoid crossing certain red lines. The Houthis continue their attacks, but at a level designed to pressure, not provoke, a massive retaliation. Shipping routes remain tense, but not fully shut down. Global markets remain volatile, but do not collapse. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels begin to activate. Messages are passed through intermediaries. Quiet negotiations begin, and slowly over time the intensity decreases. This is the best-case scenario, not peace, but containment. A situation where the war remains dangerous but does not spiral out of control. But there is a second scenario. And this is where things become far more serious. Regional escalation. In this path, the network of allied groups continues to activate. Hezbollah increases its operations from Lebanon, militias in Iraq escalate their attacks on U.S. bases, the Houthis intensify their strikes, not just on military targets, but on shipping lanes, possibly even attempting to block the Bab al-Mandab. At the same time, Iran steps up its involvement, either directly or indirectly. Israel responds with wider air campaigns. The United States increases its military presence, and suddenly, the conflict is no longer limited to a few exchanges. It becomes a full-scale regional war, multiple countries, multiple battlefields, constant escalation. In this scenario, the economic impact becomes severe. Oil prices surge, global trade slows dramatically, energy supplies become uncertain, and countries far from the Middle East begin to feel the pressure. But even this is not the worst-case scenario. There is a third possibility, and it is the one that keeps policymakers awake at night. Global escalation. This is the point where the conflict crosses a line that is difficult to define, but easy to recognize when it happens. It could be a major attack that causes mass civilian casualties. It could be the destruction of critical infrastructure. It could be a direct confrontation between major powers. Or it could be a single decision made in a moment of urgency. In this scenario, more countries are pulled in, not just politically but militarily. Alliances are activated, defense treaties come into play, naval forces from multiple nations move into the region, airspace becomes crowded with competing forces, and the risk of direct confrontation between global powers increases. This is how regional wars turn into global conflicts, not through a single event, but through a chain reaction. And in today's interconnected world, that chain reaction can move faster than ever before. But there is one more factor that makes this moment particularly dangerous, and that is the presence of nuclear weapons. Now, to be clear, no side has indicated that nuclear use is imminent, but in high-intensity conflicts, the risk is never zero, especially when red lines begin to blur. In the Middle East, there has always been an unspoken understanding. Certain thresholds should never be crossed, certain actions should never be taken. But as conflicts escalate, those boundaries can shift. If a nation feels existentially threatened, if it believes its survival is at stake, the calculations change, and decisions that once seemed unthinkable begin to enter the realm of possibility. This is why analysts often speak about escalation ladders, each step representing a higher level of conflict, each step increasing the risk. And once you start climbing that ladder, it becomes harder and harder to come back down. Right now, the world is somewhere in the middle of that ladder, not at the top, but no longer at the bottom, and the direction of movement is uncertain. But beyond the military and political analysis, there is a human reality to all of this. Because every escalation has consequences, not just for governments, but for people. Families living in conflict zones, workers dependent on stable economies, communities affected by rising prices and uncertainty. For them, this is not a strategic game. This is daily life. This is survival. And as the conflict expands, the number of people affected continues to grow. This is the part that is often overlooked, the part that does not always make headlines, but it is the part that matters the most. Because in the end, the true cost of any war is not measured in territory or power. It is measured in human impact, and that cost is already rising. But even now, despite all the risks, despite all the escalation, there is still one factor that could change the course of events: choice. Every decision made from this point forward matters. Every response, every escalation, every attempt at de-escalation. Because history is not just shaped by events. It is shaped by the choices made in response to those events. And right now, those choices are being made in real time, behind closed doors, in military command centers, in diplomatic channels, in moments of pressure, moments where the stakes could not be higher. So where does this leave us? At a crossroads, a point where the war could either stabilize or expand, where the region could either step back from the edge or move closer to it, where the next move could define not just the outcome of this conflict, but the stability of the entire region, and possibly beyond. Because the reality is this: wars like this do not stay isolated. They evolve, they spread, they reshape the world around them. And as this conflict continues to unfold, we are not just watching a war, we are witnessing a turning point. A moment that could define the future of the Middle East and influence the global balance of power for years to come. The question is no longer whether this war matters. It already does. The question is how far it will go, and whether the world can stop it before it reaches a point of no return.